On today's World Insight, crucial aid for refugees fleeing violence from Syria to Ukraine, how the International Committee of the Red Cross cope with the humanitarian crisis in the words of its president, Peter Maurer, and global food supplies under heavy strain, a closer look at the situation with the chief economist of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian. The world has been grappling with conflict, so humanitarian aid has been crucial in protecting lives threatened with armed conflict and violence. In Syria, life is harder than ever before for displaced people after a decade of crisis. Millions of Syrians have been forced to flee their homes since 2011. With a devastating pandemic and increasing poverty, every day is a survival struggle for the displaced Syrians. Peter Maurer, the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, just finished his trip to Syria to see the situation there. Around the world, amid Russia's military operation in Ukraine, there's growing concern over the humanitarian crisis there as well, the worst in Europe since World War II. Over 6 million refugees have fled to neighboring countries since the conflict started, and the numbers are still rising. I earlier talked about all of these with Peter Maurer, the president of ICRC. Right off from the plane, now you are sitting here with me for your latest trip to Syria. I know you were there visiting one of those camps and heartbroken when you see the scene over there. Tell me more about that.
Well, you know that the Syrian conflict has now entered into its 11th year, and there are, of course, multiple challenges in the country. One particular challenge emerged from the last battle against the Islamic State group, which has left tens of thousands of women and children in camps in the northeast of Syria. Many of them Iraqis, some of them Syrians, but also from more than 60 countries around the world. And I think it's these camps which represent a particular humanitarian challenge. They have been relatives, women of Islamic State fighters, and contrary to their husbands who went into detention when captured in the last battles, these women went into these camps. And one of, or two of the main issues we are looking at since then is, of course, to ensure that basic humanitarian assistance comes to those camps and that humane conditions exist in those camps, and this is particularly challenging.
You said in one of your latest press release that it is a shame for the international community. Tell me more about that.
Well, what is a shame for the international community is that these children and women are left there without really a consistent and major effort to repatriate the foreigners into those 60 and more countries home. Some countries have made effort, we appreciate, but still 56,000 people are there, 70% or more of them children, and they are stuck there for the last 3 years without any due process, without any review process, which would allow them to have a perspective when to get out of these situations, without really a credible legal process which would find out who is guilty of whatever violations of law and who is, just because she was a relative of a fighter there. And then there is, of course, the destiny of the children, which don't know anything about this situation. They grew up into a very harsh environment, in an acceptable environment. They are children and they are suddenly stuck in a camp in really terrible conditions in which no child should ever grow up. And I think this is the shame that the international community would not engage more and more forcefully to solve the solutions of the children, of the women, of course, and to bring some due process and better conditions to this situation.
What does it say about us? I mean, the world's capabilities to deal with multiple crises. We see so much efforts over the past few months being put on Russian-Ukraine crisis, and rightly so. And yet, there is a long-lasting problem with these women and children about Syria, and there has not been much attention paid at all.
Well, what I would regret is that we recognize on the one side how important it is to deal with all the crises emerging, and you have seen the ICRC also responding substantively to the Ukrainian crisis. But indeed, there is a lifespan of public attention to crises and of diplomatic attention to crises, which is too short. And we have increasingly long-term crises. And so it is a big challenge to get the attention back to some of the worst humanitarian situations. There is famine or approaching famine and food insecurity in the Sahel. We have the Horn of Africa in turmoil with a lot of people displaced and a lot of suffering ongoing. We have other places in the Middle East, but also in Afghanistan and around the world, which we have to focus our attention. And more equitable attention by political leaders, I think, is important. And more recognition that humanitarians alone can't do the job, that many of these issues need more sustained diplomatic and political efforts to solve.
Looking at the past, Mr. President, 6 to 8 years, you've seen dramatic changes going on in the world. For example, 8 years ago, globalization was still the key word. And now that seemed to be questioned by some. Meanwhile, the rules of the world seem to be quite clear years ago, at least apparently. And yet now you see countries, big powers breaking the rules. So what does that mean to humanitarian organizations like you? How can you still be persuasive to state leaders who are mainly preoccupied by mainly their national interests and their interests of their region?
We are particularly challenged by what you describe, in particular with regards to the rules part. ICRC is not just a relief organization, it's an organization with a mandate to support states to apply and implement the Geneva Conventions. In that sense, I have always advocated for a bigger diplomatic space in which we engage quietly and find practical solutions for people. We need, of course, to respect the rules, but also to recognize that in a divided world, sometimes there are different perspectives on rules. I'm deeply convinced that we need to refocus the attention of governments and political decision makers about the practical significance of these rules to solve problems. Rules are not only here to be respected because they are rules. Rules are also here to be respected in order to help us solve problems. Rules shouldn't be diligently ignored just because power interests point you short-termedly into a different direction. This is our message and our work with states, signatories to the Geneva Convention, and it has to translate from the prisoners of war in so many contexts to the civilians detained, to those who cross front lines. All these delicate issues are somehow regulated by an important body of law to which every state has subscribed.
There has been apparently a hurrying up by some to brush away the earlier rules, to also brush away the efforts made by earlier generations out of chaos and wars to lay the foundation for peace for today. we see that in different parts of the world, that ignorance and attempt to ignore. So, Mr. President, at this moment, how can you and humanitarian organization embracing the Geneva Convention function under the circumstances? What do you think is the best way for you?
Well, let's not forget that many belligerents around the world, state and non-state, they know the Geneva Conventions, they know the rules, and I would even acknowledge that they want to make the effort to respect the rules. And therefore, I have always maintained that positive examples and enlarging positive examples on how respect can work is as good as slamming the heads when violations have happened. I think we have to be clear what a violation is, but we have also to build on an existing consensus and again to demonstrate how useful these tools are. And very frankly, the principles of humanitarianism, if I think about the people displaced in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in the Sahel, in Ukraine, and other places of the world, all these principles are eminently practical, and they help us approach protracted situations of conflict. I think we need to recognize and also to demonstrate the practical usefulness. And I do believe that trips like the one that I have done now to Syria are here to reinforce the vision on how practical the principles of humanity can be translated by the respect of the rules. It is the right for civilians to have access to basic services. So we need to ensure an environment in which basic services have been able and are able to be delivered. That was another important aspects of my visit to Syria, that we are looking into long-term protracted conflict with weak services to people in order to strengthen the response of humanitarians and governments and all those actors in the field so that the delivery of services, of basic services to people can be enhanced.
I see. You talk about protracted crisis and wars. That also seem to be the way people are describing now, Russian-Ukraine crisis right now. How do you and your colleagues at ICRC looking at the latest situation? Tell me more about your challenges operating on the ground.
I think what we see in an increasing number of conflicts around the world is really that the short term, the medium, and the long term happen at the same time. Maybe in the past we had periods where predominantly my organization and humanitarian organizations were busy responding to the emergency. Today we see that emergencies last forever and they last for decades. And therefore we need to adapt our methodologies, but we need to adapt these methodologies not by leaving aside emergency. What we need to do is being able to respond at 2 or 3 levels. We need still to assist those who have been displaced yesterday, and they need food and water and a shelter and medicine. But then we also need to deal with those who have been displaced for the last 5 years or 10 years in order to build something more permanent around them. That's infrastructure work, that's support for investment in fragile contexts. That's a different type of activity. If I look today, we have water engineers fixing destroyed pipes in Ukraine at the present moment at the front lines. These water engineers are experts in medium and long term. These water engineers, they are not delivering just water trucks to displaced populations. Water engineers, they are fixing systems. When I send a surgical team, then they are responding to an emergency, but at the same time, they develop capacities for war surgery at large and for dealing with complicated secondary and tertiary consequences.
Right.
So you see, the big challenge today is that the short, the medium, and the long term happen and need to happen at the same time, and need to find a more sophisticated response than just an emergency response which lasts for today and tomorrow.
Neutral organization like yours is very crucial in playing a pivotal role during a crisis. And yet, when you talk about the quiet diplomacy, which you have to exercise as a neutral organization, is extremely difficult. Now, people want you to stand in one team or another team. So that has been reflecting in some of the latest crises ICRC has been trying to help with, to deal with. Tell me more, Mr. President, about how to be still consistently neutral, really putting more efforts into the quiet diplomacy, as you said, behind the scenes.
Well, I do understand that in any conflict, and even in hot, and in particular in hot conflicts, which are emotionally charged because countries are waging war against each other, that in these conflicts, there seems to be little space for neutrality because societies are deeply divided, countries are deeply divided, and when these divides happen, the space in between tends to shrink. On the other hand, I think we demonstrate each and every day that in order to preserve lives and livelihoods of people, in order to do the core of our mandate, there is a thing in between. And this thing in between needs to grow and to be strengthened. If we were not neutral, we couldn't cross the front line. We couldn't have evacuated people from Sumy and Mariupol over the last couple of days because we wouldn't have been able to cross the front line and have the trust of both sides. If we are not neutral and we don't have the trust of both sides, we couldn't imagine helping the families looking for the missing people on both sides, because we need to be able to connect the data points and to find people. If we wouldn't be neutral, we wouldn't be able to work on both sides of frontline and assist the neediest, which need to be assisted. And so there is a space, while I do recognize that in a hyper-connected and alert media environment in which political divisions are central to a society, it is difficult. I want to maintain that quiet diplomacy, the negotiation of neutral and impartial and independent humanitarian spaces are absolutely critical for life-saving, but also for trust building amongst belligerents. If I'm proud of one thing is that wherever we are able also to connect belligerents, even if discreetly, in order to let us work for something which is essential for people, either basic services or life-saving operations or surgery in a hospital or the delivery of food along contacts line and into difficult to reach areas. And this can only be done by somebody who has the trust of both sides, and having the trust of both sides needs neutrality. At least that's our understanding.
I hope more people will understand what you have been talking about and really respect that. Peter Maurer, President of ICRC, always a pleasure, sir. Thank you so much for your service.